Firstly, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And it's a great privilege to introduce Peter Ryan to you. I suspect he's known to many of you already. I'm happy to be recorded, sorry. So I suspect he's very well known to many of you already. If you've ever been staring at a little brown job flitting around in a bush and wondered what it was, you may well have reached for one of his guidebooks. So that includes the Cecil, the Roberts, and a book on birds of Africa south of the Sahara, amongst some others. And Peter is a very accomplished scientist and with a very inspirational CV, if you can get past feeling a bit inadequate at looking at it. But so I really am grateful to him for making time to talk to us tonight. Peter was very concerned about plastics probably a long time before any of us even realized that they were a problem, and completed his master's in the mid-80s on the effects of plastic ingestion on seabirds. And since then has published another 64 papers on the subject, in amongst all the other hundreds of papers that he's done. So I think the challenge for Peter tonight is to distill that into a message for us. But I'm sure he's up to the task. So without further ado, hand over to Peter. Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Colleen, and thanks, guys, for taking the time on what is a fairly chilly evening. I hope you can all hear me all right. Just shout if the volume goes weird or anything. I'm going to leap straight in. Colleen asked me to talk for sort of 20 minutes, and I warned her that I struggle to talk for 20 minutes about plastics just because I get passionate about it, but let's see how we go. I'm trying to give you the really short version. So I guess I'm just going to tell you a little bit about why we should be concerned about plastics in the ocean, and then go on to talk about some of the solutions, perhaps, although primarily looking at targeting sources to find out where it's all coming from. That's been the focus of a lot of our work for a while. So this is the sort of classic ugly face of plastics in the environment, animals being entangled and dying or being impeded in various ways. And it's, as I say, it's the visible face of plastic. It affects quite a high proportion of organisms, but generally it's quite a rare thing still. So I did a review a few years ago, which was an interesting exercise because I ended up using a lot of web-based resources like Google Images to find pictures of entangled animals, and added substantially to the list of species that have been recorded. So about a third of all seabirds, for example, have been entangled in plastic or recorded as entangled in plastic. If you move to freshwater birds, the proportion drops, and if you move to terrestrial birds, it gets even lower still. So we looked at the whole range of species. But the point I want to make is that although it's quite a pervasive problem that affects a moderately large proportion of species, the incidence is so low that it actually has very little impact on most populations. So it's more of an animal rights and ethical kind of issue than it is a conservation issue, in that it's not really driving any species towards extinction. A much more problematic issue is that of ingestion, because it affects much higher proportions of individuals within populations. So for example, great shearwaters, which is a species that breeds at islands in the Tristan and Gough archipelago in the central South Atlantic, and then winters in the North Atlantic, more than 90% of individuals typically contain plastic. And this has been the case since the mid-1980s. So this is actually a picture of the worst polluted great shearwater that I came across when I was doing my master's research in the mid-80s. The stomach is on the left of the image there, and all of the plastic to the right. And one thing that's worth noting is perhaps the high proportion of those little bead-like plastics, the so-called nurdles, that have been in the media in the last year or so because of the big spill that occurred off the Cape Coast. So back in the 1980s, most of the things that seabirds and turtles were eating were plastic pellets, and that's changed over the last few decades. And obviously we have to ask ourselves, does it really matter if you're eating plastic? And there's sort of three major impacts associated with plastic. One, it can block or injure the digestive tract, and this little loggerhead turtle died as a result of having its cloaca blocked by a large piece of plastic, and it had consumed all of that plastic that's in the image there. And there was so much plastic in it that it had forced its way up into the bladder and ruptured the bladder and probably led to the death of the animal. Again, this is a fairly unusual occurrence, particularly amongst birds, which I know well. It's quite unusual for birds to actually be seriously impacted by plastic ingestion in this way. They're quite remarkably tough animals. They often swallow fishing hooks when they're scavenging behind longline vessels. And we've had birds breeding with hooks protruding through the stomach, right through the body wall and out of the bird. So it's amazing what they can survive, but clearly it's not good to eat a lot of plastic. Another concern with ingesting a large amount of plastic is that it can reduce food intake through false satiation. So if your stomach is half or substantially full of plastic, you can't eat as much food. And particularly for seabirds, this is a problem because a lot of the birds that do eat a lot of plastic are scavengers. And this means that they're quite opportunistic foragers, and when they find a feeding opportunity, they want to maximize it. And if their stomach is half full of plastic, it's a bit like having your stomach stapled if you're obese. The amount of food you can eat in a single meal is greatly reduced. But for most people, probably the biggest concern is around plastics as a source of toxic compounds. And this is, as I say, the short version of the talk. We could have a whole talk about the impacts of plastic and associated compounds, but this is a growing concern as the proportion of secondary plastics or user plastics being eaten by organisms increases. We're seeing more things like flame retardants, plasticizers, colorants getting into organisms from plastics, and this is a source of considerable concern. One of the things that you might be less aware of because it's not as well publicized is that the plastic problem is certainly not a new one. And contrary to what you might think if you look at the sort of internet stories, it's not getting particularly worse. As Colleen said, I've been looking at this for quite some time now. One of the ways that we've been tracking plastic in the environment has been in seabirds that are killed by longlines. So this is going back to the mid-1990s. Some work that was initiated by WWF South Africa, looking at trying to reduce the carnage caused by longline fishing. Fortunately, we've made considerable progress since these times. So it's Keith Barnes on the left and Christian Boyks on the right, helping to process a whole load of white-chinned petrels and various albatrosses. And white-chinned petrels are quite a good species to monitor plastic ingestion because they regularly eat plastic. And so thanks to the longline fisheries, we've been able to track the incidence of plastic in white-chinned petrels over the last couple of decades. And this is a sort of pattern that we see. There's really not a strong signal of increasing amount of plastic. We had quite a bit in the sort of 2006 to 2010, but since then it's dropped down again. And this is not an isolated occurrence. In the North Sea, the fulmars that have been monitored by Jan van Franeker also have shown a decrease over the last 20 years. So it's certainly not as dire as some people would have you believe. Another long-term monitoring tool that we've used to track plastic in seabirds has been looking at the prey remains of brown skuas breeding at the Tristan Islands. So these birds are sort of gull-like things that eat other birds, and then they regurgitate the indigestible remains in little boluses called pellets. And particularly when they're feeding on things like storm petrels, which are particularly abundant at the island we work at, they produce these little lollipops with a pair of legs and a couple of wings, and then lots of plastic, or all the plastic from the bird together with bones and feathers, all bundled up nicely together. And so we can collect these and track what's happening. And again, for most of the species, certainly all of the resident species, there's no very strong signal of increasing amounts of plastic. You can see that the amounts differ between different species. So white-faced storm petrels, which are a more tropical species, contain more plastic than the white and black-bellied storm petrels. But There's no strong trend over the last 3 or 4 decades. The only species that shows some indication of an increase is the great shearwater. And here we've certainly seen some individuals with insane amounts of plastic. So this is the most polluted seabird I've ever seen. It was a great shearwater round bed in 2018, and it had almost 200 bits of plastic. And if you remember back to the previous picture where most of the plastic was pellets, you'll see here there's very few pellets at all or nurdles. It's all fragments of manufactured items. So on the one hand, the good news is that the plastics manufacturers have cleaned up their act to some extent. So the amount of nurdles in the environment has decreased substantially, but it's been probably more than offset by an increase in fragments of manufactured items. But to me, if people ask me why do I really get passionate about plastics, I think the aesthetic impacts and the economic impacts associated with those are why we really should, sit up and take notice. We just can't allow our environment to become this polluted. Now, this is a Durban beach after a rain event. The short, steep rivers in KZN, when it rains, flush an insane amount of rubbish out of primarily low-income housing areas. And it's just crazy the amount of rubbish that can appear. And we're seeing similar things, places like Strand coming out of Luandle at the moment. It's really very depressing. So there's clearly a real need to reduce the amount of plastic coming out of these kind of places. So what do we need to do to solve the problem? Well, we need to know where all the plastic at sea is coming from. And I've just indicated a lot of it's coming from land, but maybe we should interrogate that a little bit more. And that's one of the things that we've been looking at over the last couple of years. Just coincidentally, this picture is perhaps an interesting one. It looks a bit like a Cape Flats wetland, but it's actually taken at sea, out of sight of land, in the Straits of Malacca between Indonesia and Malaysia. And it gives you some idea of how polluted some bits of the ocean can become. Admittedly, it's on a drift line, so it's a concentration zone, but still there are bits of the ocean where it really does look pretty insane. We don't have anything like that in this part of the world, fortunately, yet. So where does all the litter come from? So one of the good things that happened in the early days was MARPOL Annex 5 was passed in 1989. It required 50% of the world's shipping by tonnage. The countries responsible for those vessels to agree to the banning of dumping of plastics and other persistent wastes at sea, and that came into force at the end of 1988. So since 1989, pictures like this are not happening. This was my first trip to Marion in 1984. All of the waste from the base on Marion was just dumped overboard once we left the island and got into deep water. And so one of the sort of truisms that, again, you'll see everywhere in the literature and on the internet is that 80% of the plastic in the ocean comes from land. But if you actually interrogate that number, it's very hard to see where it's come from. There's not a lot of empirical evidence in support of that. And so what we've been doing is using various markers to try to track where the litter is coming from. And we found bottles are particularly useful in this regard. So if they've got a label on, then it's very easy. You can scan the barcode, or barcodes have country-specific prefixes, so you can work out where it comes from. But even if it hasn't got a label on anymore, you can often tell from the manufacturer's marks on the lids or on the necks of bottles where they come from. And another nice thing about bottles is they often have production dates or best before dates. So you have some idea of the amount of time that the bottle could have been drifting around at sea, which, as you'll see, becomes quite useful to infer where it comes from. So this is a particularly depressing shot after a rain event at Milnerton Beach. Loads and loads of bottles wash up. And so what we do is we go and collect a couple of hundred and then process them to see where they've come from. And when we're working in a continental area where there's local sources, we obviously need to know how much of the local bottle is manufactured locally as opposed to imported. So to do this, we collect a sample of street litter. And in the case of Cape Town or South Africa more generally, around about 99% of the bottles that you find lying around the streets of Cape Town come from South African manufactured products. There's a small imported component, but it's very small. And if you go down to the beach at Milnerton or Mooley Point, you find that you see a slight increase in the foreign component, but it's still largely South African bottles. But as you move away from central Cape Town, down towards Noordhoek, if we're heading towards Scarborough there, you can see it's about 20% of the bottles have become foreign, and at Muizenberg it's about 15%. But if you move further down the peninsula or further away from Cape Town, by the time you get to Oliphant's Bos, it's almost half of the bottles are coming from foreign sources. And if you get really far out round to De Hoop or up in the Namaqualand National Park, almost 3/4 of the bottles are not South African. So we see this very interesting pattern of increasing foreign inputs as you move away from the local source. And this tells you various things. It tells you that local bottles are not dispersing very far, and it's telling you that there's obviously a lot of foreign bottles coming onto our shore from, from wherever. And one of the challenges is to work out where they come from. If we look at the countries of origin, we've found bottles from 78 countries on South African beaches, but the vast majority of them come from Asian sources, and most of those come from China or shipping hubs like Singapore. And unfortunately at the Cape, we're sitting on a major shipping route, and this is where the ages of the bottles come in useful. So we've found bottles that are less than 3 months old from Singapore or Malaysia, China, the UAE, Brazil, Nigeria, Angola, Namibia, USA, and Vietnam. So there's no ways that those bottles have drifted from land-based sources within a few months of manufacture. It would take years for a bottle to drift the kind of distances to get from China to South Africa. So it's very clear that we've got a problem with people throwing bottles illegally overboard despite MARPOL Annex 5. So one of the messages, of course, is that we need better enforcement of MARPOL Annex 5. And this is probably best achieved by monitoring the use of port waste reception facilities, so that finally managed to actually get a response. We just a few weeks ago published this paper on bottles around the South African coast, which is a follow-up to a paper we did on bottles on the Kenya coast, which show the same story, and bottles in the mid-South Atlantic, which show the same story. And finally, the IMO is starting to listen. And encouragingly also, some of the NGOs in China are starting to take this up and put pressure on the Chinese fisheries in particular to hopefully clean up their act. It's a difficult one for us within South Africa to tackle, because a lot of the shipping rounding the Cape doesn't even call in Cape ports or any South African ports. So it's got to be tackled at an international level. But it turns out that drink bottles only tell you part of the story. So most of the information that I've presented so far is based on PET bottles, these typical cool drink type bottles. But you get a rather different perspective if you look at other types of bottles, particularly high density polyethylene bottles like these ones. And this is kind of intriguing. You see these amazingly scarred bottles, particularly in the tropics, but even around South Africa, you'll find a lot of bite marks on bottles. It looks like sharks have been biting these. We're not entirely sure, but certainly some kind of fish seems to be puncturing bottles at sea. And very seldom do this to PET bottles, but perhaps they do it and they then sink, because one of the differences between HDPE and PET is that HDPE is less dense than seawater, whereas PET is more dense than seawater. So once a cool drink bottle fills up with water, it sinks to the bottom, whereas HDPE continues to float. And so if we contrast the densities of, or the origins of bottles on the West Coast and the South Coast, we see that for South America, there's more bottles from South America on the West Coast and the South Coast, as you would expect if there was some drift across the ocean. China, there's really no difference at all. In fact, there's more on the west coast than the south coast, which doesn't make any sort of sense unless they're being dumped from ships. India, there's a little bit of a signal of more Indian bottles on the east coast, which could indicate some long distance drift input. But when we get to Indonesia, we find just a massive difference between the south and east coast versus the west coast. So in the case of Indonesia, it seems that maybe there is some long distance drift signal coming through. And this becomes really obvious when you look at the relative proportion of drink bottles versus drink bottle lids. So for every Indonesian water bottle that we find on a South African beach, we find 78 Chinese water bottles, and massively more Chinese water bottles. But if we look at just loose lids from those bottles, we find 33 Indonesian lids for every Chinese lid. So it's a very, very strong swing from one extreme to the other. So the message is that PET bottles are only telling part of the story. And what we're seeing is that land-based sourced, presumably plastics coming across the Indian Ocean are carried by the South Equatorial Current, and they bash up against the East African coast and then get carried down the coast in the Agulhas Current. And the source of the South Equatorial Current is right through Indonesia, which is now rated to be the worst land-based source of plastics into the ocean in the world. It's exceeding China these days, is the latest estimate. So we're kind of downstream from the world's biggest plastic polluter, unfortunately. And so this is just looking at lids on beaches. These are lids from bottles that have been dumped from ships. And this is what the Indonesian bottles look like. So the most common brand is Danone Aqua. If you go to pretty much any Cape beach, you will find, if you look through a bunch of lids, you'll pretty soon, within maybe 50 or so lids, you'll find a couple of Danone Aqua, unless you're very close to a big sewage outfall or something. Okay, so part of the problem definitely stems from offshore, and we need to tackle it internationally by getting ships to clean up their act, and by getting Southeast Asia to clean up their act and stop losing stuff into the sea. But still, the vast majority of plastic along our coastline does come from land-based sources. And the reason we can say this is we can see very strong halos of large plastic items around urban centers. If most of the litter was coming from offshore sources, we would expect a much more uniform distribution of plastic around the coast. And these are just standing stocks. So in fact, the signal is much stronger than this because beach cleaning effort is largely concentrated in urban areas. So despite our best efforts to keep our urban beaches clean, they are still much dirtier than adjacent beaches that are not cleaned as often. So this tells us that most litter comes from local sources, but it also tells us that the dispersal at sea of that litter is fairly limited, because if most of it was going out into the sea and being dispersed around, we wouldn't see such intense localization around urban centers. And so we've been quite intrigued to look at how far does land-based litter disperse. And because I live in Muizenberg, it's just convenient to work on Muizenberg Beach. We have a nasty, rather polluted flay, despite the best efforts of many of the residents to clean it up and to stop litter getting in. I'll talk about that in a minute. Still, there's a lot of junk that comes down into sand flay every time it rains. And then in winter, when the mouth is open, a lot of that litter ends up into the sea. It's hard to really know what happens to it because the municipality spends a fortune every year cleaning the beach daily. So there are teams of cleaners out first thing in the morning at Muizenberg, cleaning every single day. So if you go down to the beach, it doesn't look too bad. But believe you me, there's a lot of litter does wash up. And one of the spin-offs of the COVID beach closures was that we were able to get a permit to do some sampling on the beach when there was nobody on the beach. So we could rule out littering by beachgoers, and we could also get around the problem of municipal cleaning because there was no cleaning going on during the beach closure period. So we counted selected litter items from Muizenberg Corner along towards Strandfontein for about 2 months the beach closure period, which was a real privilege to be able to get onto the beach when nobody else could. And this period spanned the opening of the Sandflay estuary. So this graph here is just showing you rainfall through May and June last year. And the estuary mouth was opened ahead of the first really big winter storm at the end of May. And this is what the litter arrival rate on the beach looked like. So you can see that it's fairly uniformly low amount of litter in terms of numbers of items per 100 meters of beach per day. But immediately we got that first big winter storm and the river mouth was opened. We got a big spike in the amount of litter, no surprise there. This is just looking at it in terms of that first winter storm in more detail. And there's some subtle differences between types of litter. So cigarette butts were smeared more sort of long, it took longer for cigarette butts to come down than some of the more buoyant things. So there are differences between types of plastic as to when they actually come out of the wetland, but generally speaking, they all show more or less the same pattern. But what was really interesting to me was how localized that stranding was. So if we looked, we divided the beach up into stretches of a couple of 100 meters each. Most of the signal was within 200 meters of the river mouth. So yes, we're putting stuff into the sea, but a lot of it probably washes up and washes up very close to where it goes into the sea in a system like this, where you've got active surf where the river mouth opens. So I used to be somewhat anti-beach cleaning, but I've become more of a fan of it these days. I think it serves two major purposes. One is it raises awareness of the problem. People really begin to appreciate the scope of the problem when they go down to the beach and actually have to try pick up all of the lollipop sticks and earbud sticks and bottle lids and other things that are lying around. But it also really does make a significant difference because it reduces the mass of plastic that's getting into the sea from our land-based sources, particularly if you do your cleanups close to stormwater drain outfalls or river mouths. And just to emphasize how important it is to deal with the big items on beaches, there's a lot of focus on microplastics, and that focus stems from the concerns around impacts on food webs. Small plastic items are much more likely to be ingested. They're more likely to transfer toxic compounds into marine organisms and so on, which is all true, but still the vast majority of plastics in the oceans at the moment is still in large chunks. And just to give you an indication of that, we did some size-based sampling up in the West Coast National Park, where there's a relatively infrequently cleaned beach. And in terms of the number of items on the beach, it's massively dominated by microfibers, most of which are probably not actually plastic. A lot of them are natural fibers, cotton and wool. Interestingly, it seems that microfibers, even with natural sources, last for a very long time in the environment. We don't really know much about what their impacts are. But you can see there that from the big sort of orangey pie chart, virtually everything, numerically speaking, is a microfiber. Other microplastics and other plastic litter doesn't feature at all. The density of microfibers on beaches is insane. Like, you take a handful of sand, there'll be hundreds, if not thousands, of microfibers in a handful of sand, and not just at the high tide line, but right down to the low tide and right through the beach profile. So there's just insane amounts of microfibers. However, if you look at mass, what you see is the orange has gone entirely. Microfibers don't feature. They are so small, they weigh absolutely nothing. And 90% of the mass of plastic is sitting on the surface where it can be picked up in large items and removed from the beach. So by going down to the beach and doing a cleanup, you're actually making an enormous difference in terms of reducing the mass of plastic. It's having no impact on the numbers, but in terms of the mass, it's absolutely enormous. Even if you're worried about buried plastic, yes, there is a buried component, but it tends to be much smaller things because it's much easier to bury a small thing than it is to bury a big thing. So most of the larger items, which constitute most of the mass, are visible at the surface and can be removed by cleanups. And the big advantage of this is if you take them off the beach, they don't have time to degrade. So people will tell you that plastics last forever. Yes and no. One of the biggest degrading drivers is UV light. Beaches are very high in UV. Combined with that, you've got the sort of wind-blown sand effect. But between, it depends on the thickness of the plastic. Thin plastics photodegrade pretty quickly. Thicker plastics take a while, but they all become brittle and break eventually. So if you remove them before they become brittle and break up into microplastics, you can solve a lot of the problems before they get to a point where you can't do anything about it. Of course, beach cleaning is dealing with the problem downstream. It would be much better to intercept plastic before it gets anywhere near the ocean in the first place. So increasingly, people are looking at ways of intercepting plastics in catchments. This is actually a picture from the US, down in Southern California. So it's a sort of seasonal river that just brings, looks like a pretty good production from the Cape Flats, but this is largely out of Mexico, but coming into the States on the Tijuana River. So even in the States, they have significant problems with these kinds of things. And coming back closer to home, whoops, my slide's not advancing for some reason. Just back at Sandflay again, Mike Ryder, just a concerned citizen, has been experimenting with all sorts of interceptors and came up with this series of angled nets, which passively traps a really large amount of litter coming out of some of the canals leading into the top end of Sandflay. And we've currently got a program funded by the CSIR looking at the effectiveness of various different interception systems, floating booms versus nets, versus passive traps that use differences in water height and so on to catch things. So that's quite encouraging. But of course, even intercepting in rivers is only a stopgap measure. What we really need to do is change our relationship with plastics entirely. And so most of the awareness, attention is around this kind of, circularity in the economy, recycling, trying to add value to used plastics so that they don't go into the environment in the first place. So ultimately, that's where we need to get to. The plastics problem is not really a plastics problem, it's a people problem. It's the way people deal with their waste plastics. And that's what we need to change. The solution is not to throw plastics out. You'll get people who will say, we must stop using plastics, but that's just not really a viable solution. Even from an environmental perspective, in many applications, plastics are environmentally the best solution because they're lightweight. And if you move to glass bottles or whatever, then your carbon footprint goes up because you've got heavier transport costs and so on. So, plastics have their place. We can't throw them out, but we have to use them sensibly and stop this crazy amount of plastic going into the ocean. And we have quite a sophisticated-ish plastic recycling industry in this country. The proportions of things like PET bottles and particularly HDPE bottles that get recycled is really very high by global standards. Maybe 2/3 or thereabouts get recycled. The trouble is 2/3 of billions of bottles still means an awful lot of bottles not getting recycled. And so we need to up the incentives to make it just so valuable that nobody wants to throw these things away. Okay, so that's my story. I apologize if I kind of rambled a bit, and maybe I didn't tell you what you wanted to know. But if you have any, questions, I can try to amplify them. Now I've finished, and Colleen's saying something. No.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Hi there, it's Gavin Forberg here, just a Scarborough resident. Thanks. That was fascinating and yeah, very interesting. What do you, I mean, one area of particular interest to me is, just trying to see what one can do to stop it, plastic getting into the ocean, like, the nets in rivers and so on. I do some sailing and I see Table Bay as well. It's just a nightmare in terms of the plastic that's in there. And the people at the Royal Cape Yacht Club, a lot of people are concerned and keen to get in and help and do stuff and contribute and whatever, but it's difficult to find exactly what to do. So I was wondering, what do you think are the most effective initiatives, that netting of rivers or so on, or do you know any organizations that you would recommend one get in touch with if you've got a lot of people who are keen to chip in some time or money to help solve that problem?
Yeah, and it's hard to be too generic. I think in the specific case of the Royal Cape, they struggle with having all of the storm drains of Cape Town feed into Duncan Dock, and Transnet nets that system, but I don't think their net is very effective. I've been trying to get a student to actually look at that system for some time, but I thought I had somebody from the aquarium who was keen. That never quite happened. Yeah, people, I don't know, you've got to have a certain mindset, I think, to be prepared to go and sift through storm drains. Beach litter is not too bad, but I was out this morning at Sandflay doing some stuff with my master's students, and they were saying they had 2 dogs in the nets, and it's pretty bad what you get into in the nets with all the other stuff. So yeah, in the specific of the harbour area, the easy solution would be to try to improve trapping on the storm drains, improve street cleaning. If you've got money to throw at the problem, you can solve it. You can put catch nets on individual storm drains. That's one of the solutions that's been put in place overseas, but just the cost of that is crazy. I think as an awareness step, this painted messages against storm drain inlets along roads is something that's been taken up quite widely now, which is maybe makes a bit of a difference. We're currently looking at street litter accumulation rates to try to get a handle on, who's doing what and why. But yeah, sorry, I'm kind of waffling here because I'm an ecologist, and I'm not a sociologist. And really, what we need is people who understand human behavior. It's about behavior modification. Long-term solution is, stop littering, but we've been trying to get that message into people's head for 40 years, and there's still a problem. So incentives. I'm a big fan of incentives. If you've got 9 Rand back on a 2-litre returnable bottle, you're not going to see many of those pitching up on beaches. But it's obviously problematic for things like earbud sticks. But then I think in the case of earbuds, we should just move entirely away from plastic. I think there's certain applications where plastic should be banned, because we're not going to win those ones.
Hi, Pete, can I come in? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Pete, I think it's all about, for some people's crisis and others an opportunity, and I think what we're missing here is to incentivize people to collect and plastic become like a commodity, And it's funny because I was so glad to see Gavin's around, and also Friedrich from Germany, from Planet A. And I think, I have some ideas regarding, how can we do something on the ground? In our community, how can we do like little change in a small scale, And we had this idea. I was chatting with Gavin today, and what about set up like a little collection point in Scarborough, and maybe also include red hue, and some kind of a setup where they can drop off, they can collect plastic and eco-brick the stuff, and we set up like a drop places, drop off areas. And then they can get for, I don't know, just an example, every 10 eco-brick, I get like a voucher. The voucher can be on electricity, or I don't know, cell phone vouchers, wood, firewood, compost, or seedlings for vegetable garden, and I think that's, if we can put like a price, like in range, some kind of a value into plastic, we have such a huge unemployment in this country. And there's so many people, that's, I think, would be very keen to do that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a lady in Komiki, Michelle Batty. She's doing some amazing work collecting microplastic, and she's turned into this incredible artwork. And so that kind of stuff, I think, maybe is the way to go, just to kind of find a way to motivate people to collect the stuff, have a price for it.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's quite a lot of initiatives. So there's the packaging exchange system, which has been very successful seemingly, but it's just a question of scaling it so that it's at sufficient scale to really make a difference. We produce about 4 billion cool drink bottles a year in this country, disposable. So it's just the scale of the thing is crazy. That's the challenge, is to produce solutions that can actually cope with that sort of volume. Small amounts, you can make small headway here and there, but doing it across the country is.
But maybe using like little pilot projects, maybe use Scarborough Radio as a pilot project. If it works, then move on to other communities and eventually, cities and cities, countries,
Yeah, for sure.
Can I jump in with a question? Yeah, Peter, I never knew there was so much interesting stuff that could be found out from litter. Gives a whole new view on bin picking. But my question is, do you have an idea, or are there data about what has happened to the proportion of plastic bags since the government introduced this surcharge on plastic bags? Has it had an effect, or is it had no effect?
Yeah, so we've got data from our regular beach surveys to show that post when the ban, or the levy charge was imposed by Bali Musa back in about 2002, I think it was. We saw quite a dramatic decrease in carrier bags on beaches, but it only affected carrier bags, and carrier bags are about, even before the ban, were maybe 3 or 4% of the flexible packaging that we picked up on beaches. So yes, it made a difference, but it was only a flagship kind of, it wasn't going to make a significant difference in the amount of bag-like material that was out there, unfortunately.
I'm surprised plastic bags are such a small component, because when you drive around, you get the impression that it's plastic bags everywhere, but I guess it's because they're volant almost, and so they end up in trees and hanging onto fences, so you see them more maybe. Yeah,
well, I mean, when I say carrier bags, as in the ones that were subject to the levy fee, so you still see loads of bread bags and other flexible packaging. Most of it is food wrappings. I mean, interestingly, I didn't talk about it, but those kinds of things, which I'm sure, I think it was Gavin was talking about Table Bay. I mean, in Table Bay, the vast majority of crap that you see is flexible packaging, chip packets, sweet wrappers, sundry bags that you can't identify. But as you move offshore or even longshore, those flexible packaging items disappear very quickly. We picked up bread bags on the seabed that were less than 3 months old, and they were 300 meters down. So it seems that flexible packaging, because even though it's made of plastic that's inherently buoyant, the surface area to volume ratio is such that they become fouled by marine organisms quite quickly and sediment out. So they don't travel long distances. If you go to oceanic islands, you don't find lots of chip packets washing up. It's like it's got to have been a ship or something that's dropped it. They don't travel long distances, whereas things like lids, which have got much more inherent buoyancy because they're thicker plastic, travel much bigger distances.
Just another question here, Gavin, again. Just looking at this graphic of all the lids and the brands, to what extent, doing this research, do you ever, not quite name and shame, but I don't know, try to compile statistics about brands and specific companies, and then publish those so that you can maybe get those guys to be part of the solution? I can see Fanta and Coca-Cola there and so on.
Yeah, sure. No, we do. All of our bottle papers list the top 5, 10 polluters. Coke is always number one. Interestingly, number two is it's a Chinese water bottle brand. Number three is another Chinese water bottle brand owned by Pepsi. And that's the same whether we're in the middle of the South Pacific, the middle of the South Atlantic, Cape Town. It's the same bloody bunch. But yeah, Coke is number one by a long way, and then it goes down from there. And we've obviously talked to Coke, and they're aware of the problem, and they've got their spokespeople who will tell you about all the good initiatives they're doing. But yeah, there's still way too many Coke lids out there. But one of the other, sorry, I'm a bit of a nut about bottles, but one of the interesting things is how long these bloody lids last. They last a lot longer than the bottles. So we can age a lot of the lids from their marks, not a lot, but the Coke ones in particular in this country, we can, and you find those competitions on the liners of the lids going back to the 1980s. And I'm doing regular cleanups at Olifantsbos, and we're still getting lids from 20 years ago, even though we've cleaned the beach every 3 months. So a lot of the lids are being recycled within the beach. They get buried, and then the winter storm comes through and churns everything over, and you get all of these old lids still coming up. Whereas bottles tend to be relatively recent. Because they're bigger, they don't get trapped in the beach structure and then released later. Sorry, I wasn't answering your question, but it's just...
No, that's interesting. And I wonder, do those same companies who are the main culprits, are they genuinely putting the proportionate amount of effort and money into solving the problem?
I guess it depends who you speak to. I don't know, but Coke is so visible. They're ripe for a boycott. I think they're very sensitive to the issue, but they are also the company that's actually probably pushing the most to try to move to some kind of solution with their. I don't think it's reached the Western Cape yet, but they've got this 9 Rand deposit bottle in the Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga and various places in the country on a trial basis, and it seems to be, according to them, it's going well. So if we can move a significant proportion of their products out of one-use bottles into reusable plastic with a high return value, that should go quite a long way to improving the situation.
Okay, thanks. Because also the other thing that I've noticed in just sort of the cursory, investigation and research and whatever, is many of the countries doing the research are developed countries, and their problem is completely different to, say, ours, because they don't actually have that much litter. So theirs is more a case of recycling and dealing with it. And the actual, you did highlight America there, but that river, but a lot of that seemed to come from Mexico. But a lot of the more advanced countries have very little litter, relatively speaking, and so their issues are landfill and recycling and all that, whereas ours is a much more visible problem, you know, places like Sunflower and that.
No, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the biggest challenge we face is at a municipal government level. You know, Cape Town's relatively well managed, but you go to some other municipalities and even the landfills are, you know, they're very porous. You just see a plume of plastic blowing out of landfills. It's depressing. So even if you do the right thing and get it into some kind of waste disposal stream, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to go somewhere useful and be contained. Yeah, it is a bit depressing.
So just back to my earlier question, are there any organizations that you would recommend supporting or trying to sort of reach out to, lobby groups or something that might help solving, say, the Table Bay problem in particular?
No, I mean, I guess Table Bay in particular, it's, you know, you're talking to City of Cape Town and the people who are going to make a difference, and Transnet between those two parties. Yeah, pressure groups, you know, form your own pressure group and try to get them to do a better job, but they're under-resourced, like everything. Yeah, coming back to the previous thing around adding value to stuff, there's you know, we have a huge informal plastic recycling. So one of the reasons why our plastic recycling stats globally are pretty good is because of litter picking, both, you know, at source, but also at rubbish dumps. And there's quite a big research program at UWC looking at waste and society. So there's a Saatchi chair in waste and society. Rini Schenk holds that position. She's got a very active research group looking at a lot of these problems, and maybe I'm not the right person to, you know, I can tell you about the scope of the problem. As I say, I'm an ecologist, but maybe try get Rini to come and talk to you about some of the initiatives that they're involved with, and, you know, working with people who make a living from this kind of thing.
Okay. So could you just repeat the name?
Rini Schenk at UWC. She's the chair in Waste and Society, but I can give her details to Colleen.
Okay, great, thanks.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Any more questions, anyone? Peter, you might be off the hook.
I'll stop sharing my bottle lids.
Yeah, I was enjoying those.
They're quite colourful, aren't they?
Yeah, they're very pretty. Yeah, so if there are no more questions, Peter, thank you. That was a really fascinating talk, and has certainly changed my view. I don't think I'll ever look at litter in the same way again. So, and thank you for making time for us. And yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. And yeah, I'm sure if you have any questions, we could always direct them to Peter at some point. But yeah, thank you everyone, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Guys.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.